I would like to introduce you today to Rick Gentry. Richard C. Gentry, called Rick, has served as the president and chief executive officer of the San Diego Housing Commission since 2008. With more than 300 employees and an annual operating revenue budget of $268.1 million, the agency serves low-income residents in the city of San Diego, the eighth largest city in the nation and the second largest city in California. Mr. Gentry's career in affordable housing and community development spans 46 years. Before coming to San Diego, Mr. Gentry was Senior Vice President of Asset Management for the National Equity Fund in Chicago, Illinois, the nation's largest nonprofit low-income housing tax credit syndicator. At National Equity Fund, Mr. Gentry managed portfolio investments consisting of approximately 1,600 properties, containing 100,000 units and representing a gross equity investment of $7 billion. He began his career at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1972 and has held CEO positions at the Austin, Texas, and Richmond, Virginia housing authorities. Mr. Gentry was also the Vice President for Public Housing Initiatives at the Local Initiatives Support Corporation in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Rick Gentry.
Thank you, Nan. Thanks for having me.
Rick, you've been around a while, like a lot of us have, and you're a fellow in the Academy of Housing and Communities. That means that you were selected as one of the men and women who have forged public policy and the real direction of housing and communities. So tell us a little bit about what role you played in this arena.
Now, first of all, thanks for having me, and I very much appreciate being part of the Academy and what Kent Watkins has set up here. I think if I've got a role to play in this organization, is simply one of longevity. I've been around a very long time. I came on board as a HUD intern in 1972. I like to say my first boss was Romney, not Mitt, but George, the first one. And when I came on board as a HUD intern, I had no idea I would last in this business as long as I have. But it's been a fascinating industry. It's been a great place to work, great place to spend time as if your career is mission oriented, and mine is, and managed to get a lot of good things done in that time. As you can tell by the way I sound, I may be in Southern California now, but I'm not a Southern California native to start with. It's North Carolina. And my career has taken me over the last near 50 years from North Carolina to Texas to Virginia to Chicago to San Diego. It's been a fascinating trip, not over quite yet. And I've seen a lot of changes and a lot of good accomplishments in that time.
Well, let's go back over those 50 years and tell me a little bit about how you forged public policy and what are some of your thoughts on public policy in this area?
If you can call me one thing, it is as a practitioner. And the way I look at policy is not some ethereal thing up on a hill that think tank people deal with and academic people deal with, and then it gets put on the shelf. Policy comes out of practice. And what is good policy should be what makes sense in the real world. And not just in theory, but in practicality. And to me, the policy comes from the Greek word poly, which means every, all, or many. And it's simply what you do in most cases. And to me, policy, if it's good policy, has to be adaptable enough to fit all those different places that I've lived in my career. And it also has to be adaptable enough to be changeable enough to change with time. And policies that I saw in effect when I came into the business in the early 70s, the way to go about setting policy hasn't changed, but the policies themselves have. They've adapted as time has changed and as we've gone on. And I think if I've had a role to play, it's been a kind of the everyman practitioner out in the communities, trying to let folks in policy centers like Washington, D.C., or Sacramento or other places like that figure out what their policy should be and how they should relate to the real world.
So what did you do when you were back at HUD, and what was going on back then?
It was an interesting time. When I came into HUD, the only real big programs were public housing on the public side and some of the older letter programs or number programs, 221D3s, 312, Section 236, 235. I see you smiling. You remember those days too. And it was before what was probably the most quintessential housing act of my era, and that is the Housing Act of 1974, which brought in such things as the voucher program, which I think has probably been the single best program for housing poor people that I've seen in my career. It brought in CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Program, and it brought in other programs as well on the federal level that allowed for more adaptability and fitting to local circumstances. So if you go back to the very early 70s, before 74, there were a lot of top-down command and control programs that were designed to fit the same all across the country. And that rapidly began to change in the mid 70s. And it's only continued to do so since. So I think if I could pick one big change over the last, say, 45 to 50 years, it's been a transition from those one-size-fits-all programs handed down from on high in Washington, D.C., to programs that would fit, that are allowed to be fit to the local circumstances. Anything, any program, any policy that works the same where I started my career in Greensboro, North Carolina, it works the same in San Diego, California, is destined for failure. It's got to be policy that's adaptable and policy that can change to fit the circumstances of whichever city you're talking about in the country.
So are there lessons perhaps that we have learned? Do you think that one size not fitting all is one of the lessons? Are there other lessons that maybe we've learned in adapting to where we are today?
Yes, I think so. I know just last week, HUD Secretary Carson was visiting here in San Diego, said some very complimentary things about us, which I was glad to hear. And he asked if there was one concept, one idea, one term I could give that I think would be key to helping make these programs work going forward. And the term I responded with was flexibility. We've got to be flexible to allow local decision makers to adapt programs to local needs. And I think concomitant with that flexibility has to be accountability. We've got to be on the line to show that we can get done what we said we can get done. But as long as we are hamstrung by dumb rules and regulations, it's just going to restrict how we serve our customers. So I think if there's one term, one concept that I think would encompass the way I think policies should be set up, it is flexibility on the local level.
Well, let me talk about that a little bit, because you've done some very interesting things in San Diego. One of the things that I know you're very well known for is your approach to dealing with homelessness. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Be glad to, and I don't pretend to be an expert on homelessness at all. In fact, when I got here 12 years ago in 2008, we didn't touch the subject. My predecessor, for good or for ill, decided it wasn't something to be involved in, and so we had utterly no involvement in the homelessness arena here in San Diego, which even back then had some serious problems and something like the fourth or fifth worst, largest number of homeless folks during the annual count. And the Housing Commission didn't touch it. We gradually started moving into that arena. We took over the city's homelessness programs, administration of those in 2010. Started dabbling with some RFPs and NOFAs thereafter to try to see where we could play our proper role in that arena. And then in 2014, I decided we dabbled enough, we needed to jump in feet first and either sink or swim. And so on November the 12th, 2014, we announced something called Housing First San Diego. And it was a series of 5 different programs to deal with 5 different areas of homelessness. And homelessness, I'll point out, is not a cause, it's a result, and it's a symptom of deeper issues. And there's more than just one. It's more than just a quintessential mental health issue on the streets, that, although that certainly is a big problem with chronic homelessness, but it goes all the way to what I call economic displacees who are having trouble making it in a very high cost area, and they don't have financial or family reserves to fall back on. So anyway, in 2014, we crafted our Housing First San Diego set of plans, announced them, put them on the street, and we targeted that over the following 2.5 years to the summer of 2017, we would get 1,500 people off the streets, 1,500 households. And what we actually accomplished in that time was just under 3,000 households. And so from that, we decided to branch out, and we've now got probably 20 different programs fitting different issues in the homelessness arena. And since November of 2014 to now, which is the end of February 2020, we've actually provided what we call housing solutions to over 8,500 households here in San Diego. And by solutions, I mean either getting people off the streets or helping them to avoid the streets in the first place through diversion programs, or just helping people stay in place, and or helping connect people with loved ones elsewhere. We've had a lot of different program approaches. And I'll point out, if you look at the most recent housing count from a year ago, the one last month has not yet been tabulated, but the one from January of 19, San Diego is the only major municipality on the West Coast that's not seen a spike in homelessness numbers over the past 2 to 3 years, like our counterparts up the coast, like in LA and the Bay Area and Seattle. And I'm not saying we've solved the problem. I'd be either a fool or a liar if I said that. I know I'm not the latter, I hope I'm not the former, but we've not solved it. But I think that we've addressed it properly. And I think that what we've done is setting the stage going forward into the future. The 6 months ago, in October of 2019, the City Council blessed and adopted a strategic plan on homelessness that the Housing Commission had commissioned from the Corporation for Supportive Housing, headed by Ann Oliva and her folks, who came in here and did a lot of legwork, a lot of stakeholder work, and as an outside experts, and helped us put together a strategic plan going forward. I'm quite pleased with what we've done in the homelessness arena in the past. And I think that we've had a fair measure of tactical successes, but we've not solved the problem. We're not sure we even know where we're going all the time. So what I'm thinking with this strategic plan, though, is that that's going to give us a framework, a set of directions that the whole community can buy into, and they have. And we set up both some 3-year and some 10-year goals that I think are achievable. So we decided that the homelessness problem has taken decades to build up. That hasn't occurred just lately, and it's going to take a while to deal with, but we're dealing with it. And I think it's been probably one of the my 2 or 3 best successes here. Again, not that we've solved it, but that we are addressing it the right way.
I totally agree with you, because I have talked to people in Honolulu, for instance, who are also doing the Housing First program. And it sounds like it's absolutely a big piece of the answer, because you're treating the whole person, not just the problem of housing, which is, I think, what you were saying.
Yeah.
So one of the things that she said is that it just takes a lot of money. It's expensive to do it. Tell me how you get around that, or how do you get the money to do it? Do you had to be real creative in your sources of money? How have you done it?
Well, there isn't a one solution, and some of it is very expensive. Building permanent supportive housing for chronic homelessness is expensive. Both building new structures, particularly in California, and providing the services, but not all of it is. And there are a lot of different techniques and things to do. Of these 8,500 household successes I mentioned a while ago, fewer than 1,000 of those are new builders of central rehabilitation properties. The rest of it is the existing marketplace. Now, we have used some substantial voucher resources for it. I think 4,000 of our 15,500 vouchers are being used by designated for use by homeless right now. And I'm sure we're going to use more vouchers going forward, and that's an expense. But there are other techniques as well. We've utilized a lot of money that comes through the continuum of care. The Housing Commission has received probably about 25% of the funding that comes in for the region for COC purposes. We've received some monies that come through the state for homelessness purposes as well. But there are some fairly inexpensive techniques that we've done too that have helped. Let me give you a couple of examples. We initiated a program in July of 18, just over a year and a half ago, to help prevent prevention of homelessness or diversion. And it's a lot cheaper if you keep somebody in place by helping them cover a bill or two, as long as you figure out a way to do it without creating dependency. But you've got the quintessential $500 car repair problem. What if somebody needs $500 to fix their car in order to go to work? Well, they don't have enough money in reserve to do that and pay the rent. So they fix the car, they don't pay the rent, they get evicted. Sometimes a little bit of help can go a long way. And we have helped just in a year and a half, about 1,000 families with short-term issues stay in place. Now, some would say that's not a housing issue, that's a social services or a welfare issue. And I would say, what's the difference? If you help somebody stay in place, that's a pretty efficient way to spend the taxpayers' money and to keep from burdening the community. We've also learned some other lessons that have helped us make our programs work. And I'll give you an example. In early 2000, I'm losing my years here, early 2014, no, early 2015, the Housing Commission developed a program called Housing Our Heroes. And it was my idea that if we did a concentrated effort, we should be able to get 1,000 homeless vets off the streets in 12 months' time. It made perfect sense to me. It actually took us about 18 months because we really didn't know what we were getting into. This was our first foray at doing initial outreach and offering of vouchers to homeless individuals and families. And as you know, Nan, for a typical Section 8 voucher family, by the time they get a voucher, they've been on the waiting list 7, 8, 9, 10 years. They know what's coming. They know what they're going to do with the voucher. It comes in, slam, bam, it gets done, and just immediately. Typically 30 to 60 days, and you don't have a problem. If you have a problem, it's unusual. Well, for the homeless cohort, it's a different group, particularly the chronic. And the homeless vets are some of the most difficult to deal with chronics out there. So we would go out and give a voucher to them, and they'd sit and stare at us. Didn't know what to do with it. And so about 2 to 3 months into the program, we had nothing to show for ourselves and beginning to get worried. So we did the first thing you do when you don't know what you're doing, you try to learn. And so we figured out, number one, these folks did not know how to connect with the resources. So we hired a cadre of professionals to connect them. Some housing navigators are their formal title. I call them real estate agents for the homeless, to go out there and connect people with resources. And most of us, we go to buy a house, and we think we're capable, and you typically hire an agent to help us connect. We did the exact same thing with this cohort of folks. We hired a group of real estate agents for the homeless. They did the connecting. And then the real estate community responded to us, and we have a good relationship with the real estate community through our voucher program. And we pay our part of the rent on time, and we don't have problems and all that. But this was a different cohort of people. And the landlord community looked back at us and said, Rick, we're not so sure about this group. We think there's risk here. We don't want to put ourselves at risk. So thank you, but we're not interested. And then I said, well, what will it take to alleviate your feelings of risk? And they said, well, of course, money. But so cover a downside. So I said, okay. And I firmly believe that one of the roles of government in leveraging the private sector is to reduce their risk. And what I tell my private sector partners is I don't expect you to lose money on one of my programs. I want you to make money so you can pay more taxes to pay more for more housing for me to do. So what we did with the landlords is we came up with a series of extra reserves, which we could do because we're moving to work agency, and and I get into that if you want me to. But that allowed us the flexibility to set aside some reserves. And then when the landlord saw that, they figured, okay, we got our downside covered. We'll do business with you. And so it took us 18 months to house these 1,000 vets instead of 12 because we lost about 3 to 6 regrouping and figuring out what we should have figured out to start with and didn't know. And we've since expanded the housing navigators and the reserves, not only to all other homeless folks that we house with our vouchers and our rapid rehousing program, which is kind of like a voucher light. But we've applied it to our whole Section 8 inventory. So it's been, got a phone ring here. There we go. But we've kind of tried to learn as we go. And I think that's what I mean by flexibility, adaptability, accountability. You recognize that you've got to learn because things always change. They always have in the 48 years I've been in this business, and the change is it's going to keep on happening. It's life.
So I think this could be one of your big legacies, don't you?
It could well be. And I think that what we've targeted to going forward, and this is going to be the next chapter of my career, is going to be if we can get this sucker solved. And I think we've targeted over the next 3 years with our efforts to do 3 things. Number one is to eliminate veterans homelessness in San Diego. And I'll use all the usual modifiers that, eliminate means doesn't mean you get every one of them off the streets, but you've got an offer for everyone who can take it, and most of them are gone. So it's to virtually eliminate homeless veterans off the streets. Same is true with juveniles, with kids, with people under 18 years old. And then the third is to reduce the number of people who are unhoused homeless by 50%. That was going to be huge. Right now, if you look at the entire region, and the region is the county, there are, at last count, about 8,100 homeless. Of those, about 5,600 are in the city. And about half of those are in shelters of various sorts and half unhoused. So just under 3,000. So I think getting that number cut by half over 3 years is doable with what we see as targeted and current resources. Longer term, we've got some 10-year goals as well, but those will be dependent on additional funding sources over time. There are 2 bond issuances, bond referenda rather, that are up for public consideration this calendar year. One is will be heard during the primary next month in March of 2020. The other one is on the ballot for the general election in November of 2020. And if we get both of those, we're going to have some pretty good funding streams to address this stuff. If we don't, then we'll have to look for other approaches. But back to your original question, do I think this is my legacy? I think is one of them. And I think it's certainly one that is needed in the country right now, not just in San Diego.
You also could possibly have a legacy in the tax credit world. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was the job I was in before I came here. A little bit of information before that. I spent the first 26 years of my career in the public sector side. Greensboro, North Carolina, Austin, Texas, Richmond, Virginia, 1972 to 1998. And by the time I got done in Richmond, I was so burned out I couldn't stand it. I swore I was ready to walk away from the public sector and never come back. So I spent 10 years in the private world, 2 years in Washington, D.C., and then 8 years in Chicago, and doing tax credits. And I was with the National Equity Fund, which is a subsidiary of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC. And National Equity Fund, or NEF, in Chicago is the nation's largest nonprofit tax credit syndicator, low-income housing tax credit syndicator, that is, LITAC. And my job, I was not the CEO there. I worked for a fellow named Joe Hagan, who's now retired. But I was senior VP of asset management. My job was to oversee our portfolio across the country. And when I left to come out here to San Diego in 2008, I had responsibilities to oversee our investments, which was over $1 billion at that point, in 1,600 properties, 100,000 units in 42 states. Yeah, I lived in an airplane, and you personally know what that's like. We had a lot of products spread out. I had staff spread out from Rhode Island to Los Angeles. We had product pretty much everywhere. Largest portfolio was in New York, followed by California, followed by Illinois, and then kind of tapered off from there. But it was a big operation, and unlike a lot of housing programs, this one was private sector governed. Your investors were typically big financial organizations, Bank of America, Chase, Citi, people like that, who have real money that they do not want to lose. And so that produced a lot of discipline for us. And what I tell people is, if you take tax credits as a supply side subsidy, and you combine that where you can with vouchers as a demand side subsidy, then you can house the same population public housing houses, but with a whole lot better market discipline and a whole lot better results, and you wash out your problems as you need to, which has never happened in the public housing side. And as a tax credits is a good program. I mentioned a while ago, I think that the voucher program is the best single program for housing before I've seen in my career. I think tax credits is a close second. And if you marry those two together, you've got an extremely valuable, worthy product that can work anywhere.
What would you say are the biggest downsides of public housing today?
Well, I think public housing is a failed business model, and it has been for decades. And that's not to denigrate the residents who live there or the professionals who make it work. It's just a failed model. It just doesn't work. And I said this in a paper that I gave to the Commission on Troubled Public Housing back in 1990, when that was held. You've got a system that punishes good behavior and rewards bad behavior. It's a classic that you do not want to have happen. It punishes residents for working where they can. It certainly doesn't enable them to or reward them to. And if you're running public housing, then it takes a literal act of Congress to get some modernization money put into a property. That's a bad program. In fact, when I was in that world, I used to describe myself as one of the best East German business managers you're ever going to find. It was like the Soviet system. You take a top-down command and control, one-size-fits-all product, and make it work the same over the whole country. Nothing works that way. And the only thing that surprised me is that the industry has not collapsed any sooner than it has. It's also the largest real estate program in the country, not governed by real estate principles. It's a social program with the real estate, the product, as an afterthought. And no wonder it's been in a continual state of decline for most all of my career. I think Hope 6 back in the 90s was a good start at eliminating some of the worst of the product, which could not be rehabilitated. And I think that RAD the rental assistance demonstration program has a lot of good features to it. I think there's limiting the product to the subsidies that in public housing, it's going to create some real stresses in the RAD program in about 10 years from now. That's going to be the next one for those that follow behind you and me to figure out how to solve. But I'll point out that one of the legacies that I'm particularly proud of here in San Diego is that we converted 1,366 former public housing units to vouchers using the demo dispo part of the Housing Act of 1998. We did that conversion back when I was first hired to come here. HUD approved it in 07. I was hired to implement it thereafter. Took about 4 years. And we did promise HUD would do 3 things in that conversion. Number one, we did not project base the vouchers on our properties, which I think is a pretty gutsy thing to do. We basically said we'll operate those properties in the modest market, what I call the modest marketplace, whether the voucher holder stayed in those units or not. And we said if a voucher holder took their subsidy and moved out, we'd backfill behind them with families at or below 80% of median income, 50% if they're elderly, and we make those properties work on those rents. And we've done so and have now over half those units have been vacated by their voucher holders, either relocating, either typically due to family or employment. And we backfilled and with families from the modest marketplace. It's working well, which means that effectively we've expanded our scope of affordable housing by backfilling from families who moved out. We also further said that we would take the equity lying fallow in the ground in those properties, and we create additional affordable housing with that equity, at least 350 units. And what we did then was in very late 2009 and in 2010, we issued some $95 million in debt on those properties, those 1,366 units, or for really about 1,000 of those units. We did it through an FHA product and a Fannie Mae product. We then went on a shopping spree at the bottom dead center of the real estate collapse out here, which was pretty good timing. And instead of 350 units, we increased our stock by 810 units, paid for by those 1,366 units. I think that's a pretty fair indication that there is value in our products typically that we don't address. And that leads me back again to the public housing program and some of its failures. It's a social program that looks to house people. Currently, it does not take a long-term look at the resources, and it does not manage the value of the properties. And I think you've got to manage the value of the properties, and you've got to look at it as real estate, not a social program, in order to provide that social good to families who need it, or else you wind up with the program just atrophying, killing itself over time. So I'm real pleased with what we did in our conversion. I'll point out to people that although we did this under the demolition disposition provisions of the 1998 Act, we didn't tear anything down. We didn't dispose of anything. We merely did a program conversion from Section 9 of the Housing Act to Section 8 of the Housing Act. And we are housing more people better now than before with no additional outlay from the taxpayers. Almost a loaves and fishes story.
That's fantastic. You know, as I sit here and listen, I think about a lot of the reason that you've been able to do what you've done is, of course, your creativity and gutsiness to be able to get out and do some of this. But it also revolves around the fact that you are an MTW, or moving to work agency, doesn't it?
It's huge.
And so when you talked to the secretary, when he came out and visited you, and you said, what we really need is more flexibility, we need to be able to make some of those decisions at the local level. I assume that you're speaking definitely through experience, and that that's important to you, is that flexibility.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder whether that, how you feel about that being ported nationwide. In other words, how you feel about
Yeah.
making MTW, because with flexibility comes accountability. And you said that. But what about, how do you ensure the accountability when you have that much flexibility that HUD is not going to be able to provide a ton of oversight?
Well, um, I think HUD can provide that oversight. And let me give you an example. Fannie Mae, now they had their troubles back when the Great Recession occurred, and everybody knows that. But it had to do with the way they financed properties, not the way they oversaw or asset managed their investments. In fact, they had one of the sanest systems of oversight I've ever seen. They had about half a dozen people who asset managed asset managers who asset managed properties. Okay? They wholesaled it down to the retail level. And so the way I would describe that in layman's terms is that they had all these properties out there that were dependent on Fannie, owed their being to Fannie's money. And Fannie had to protect their investment. Fannie hired some asset managers, some companies to oversee these. And then with their own staff, oversaw the companies overseeing the properties. You can do that with existing HUD personnel. Well, let me rephrase. You can do that with the existing HUD structure. It might require a different set of skills on the part of some other people, but it's doable. I think that the old adage that if you only want more of what you got, keep doing things the same way you're doing it, applies to HUD. HUD needs to change. HUD needs to modernize. HUD needs to come into the modern world. And getting that understood, I think, is huge. Now, in terms of downstreaming Hope 6, moving to work, I think every housing agency in the country that's not on the trouble list should be moving to work. I think that HUD should allow greater flexibility, greater latitude, and cut them loose. But I would also say that HUD needs to take out the bad performing agency much quicker than HUD does. And the old model has been HUD would overly manage and restrict the well-performing agencies and leave the bad ones alone because HUD was scared of them, didn't know what to do with them. So by the time HUD would step in, the agency was so far gone that only the nuclear option of a takeout through some sort of receivership was the only thing to do. If HUD had been able to step in earlier and say, well, this property is being badly managed, we're going to take that away from you. And that's the way it works in the private sector. Don't wait till the agency's gone. Take out the bad player when it happens. And that's the way HUD does it on the FHA side, where it's not, and I know that there are different set of issues over there, but not like on the public housing side. I think that on the public housing side, you've restricted the money, you've restricted the income, you've restricted rents. There's been no capital money. Properties have deteriorated over time. There's not always been the best management of some of the agencies as there could be. And then HUD comes in too late to make a difference and the agency's gone. It couldn't have been much worse than the way it's been in public housing for the last 50 years. So I think I would cut people loose and give them more freedom and give them more moving to work flexibilities. But I would take out the bad players in the New York.
Well, that is just fascinating. In fact, the whole conversation, I could talk to you forever. It's been so much fun. I just really appreciate your time, Rick. I know how much you've been involved in and how hard it is to get any time away, but you've had a lifetime of service, a lifetime. And you've accomplished so many things. I don't think most people have nearly as many legacies, as you have. And you should feel very, very proud of that. And I thank you for the number of years as a taxpayer that you have put into housing and making our communities better. So thank you.
Thank you, Nan. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate the conversation. Anytime in the future you want to call, we'll talk.